Welcome. My name is Joe Paprocki, and I'm the National Consultant for Faith Formation at Loyola Press, a Jesuit ministry operating out of beautiful Chicago, Illinois. And we're very excited to have with us today Dr. Austin Ivory, who's going to be sharing with us his wisdom about what it would be like to be on retreat with Pope Francis. What kind of wisdom would Pope Francis share? And he shares all that with us in his new book, First Belong to God, which we'll tell you more about in a minute. But I just wanted to alert you to that and get you thinking about what you're going to hear today. As you can see, Austin is with us and ready to go. A couple of housekeeping details. This webinar is being recorded, and you will all receive a link to the recording within a day or two. And as well as anyone who registered for this will be receiving the link to that recording as well. We are in webinar format, meaning that you will not be able to unmute yourself or to turn on your camera. Other than that, I think we're ready to launch in and to begin, first of all, meeting our guest, who is Austin Ivory. Austin, how are you today?
I'm good, Joe. It's good to be with you.
Thank you so much. For folks who are just meeting Austin for the first time, he is a British writer, journalist, commentator on religious and political affairs. He holds a PhD from Oxford University, and there's much more to your bio, but I'm going to let you tell us a little bit more about yourself. Austin, tell us what you do for a living and what kind of religious and political affairs perhaps you comment on.
Sure. Well, it's great to be with you, Joe. It's great to be with all of you. It's so impressive to see all these names and places from across the world. And I'm delighted also that we're joined by my publisher, Gary, who I see is online as well. It's been a real pleasure to publish with Loyola Press. They've been absolutely wonderful to work with. This is my first spiritual book. So what I've done up till now during the pontificate, what I'm known for, are two biographies of Pope Francis. One was called The Great Reformer, which came out in 2014 and 2015, and then again a book called Wounded Shepherd, which came out in 2019. And then in 2020, I did a book with Pope Francis, which I think quite a few of you will be familiar with. It's called Let Us Dream,
Yes.
which was a huge privilege. And generally, that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years, really, ever since publishing the biography. I guess I've been explaining, promoting, talking about, writing about the pontificate. And really, this comes after a kind of many couple of decades, I'd say, of being in the world of what might call Catholic journalism and commentary, writing for various different organs. But here in the UK, was where I'm based. I'm speaking to you from the west of England. Wales is about 20 minutes down there. And I live here on a small farm. And when I'm not here, I'm in Rome usually. For every few months I'm in Rome for stuff happening there.
Wonderful. So we get a bird's eye view of your experience being in Rome, and what a blessing to have that relationship with our Holy Father, to be able to co-author a book with him, which you refer to a number of times in your current book. And I think there's such wonderful thoughts that are being shared in each of this. But the book that you've done with Loyola Press, and we have thoroughly enjoyed our relationship with you, Austin. Loyola Press is thrilled to publish your book, First Belong to God, on retreat with Pope Francis. And folks, there's a QR screen right on your screen there, that a QR code, I should say, that you can go ahead and scan, so you have information about purchasing that book. But in the meantime, while you're doing that, Austin, tell us about this book, how it came to be, and what you have in mind for sharing with us today.
Thanks. So yeah, well, I mean, I've this is the first time I've ever written a retreat book, or indeed even a spiritual book. Of course, I'm familiar with the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius because I was many years ago, in the late 90s, a Jesuit novice for a while, and certainly in the last 10 years, I've been doing an 8-day retreat most years. So I guess I'm formed by Ignatian spirituality,
Sure.
and I'm familiar with the exercises. So this book specifically comes out of an experience in 2020 when the UK province of the Society of Jesus asked me to give a retreat an 8-day retreat, give the points, as it were, in an 8-day retreat on the pontificate of Francis. So introduce us, Austin, to the main themes of the pontificate using the spiritual exercises as a framework. So that's what got me working on this idea. And then at the time, I was also doing Let Us Dream. So when they said after the retreat, you should write it up, I didn't for 2 years, and I really only got down to it finally last year and broadened it and made it a much sort of broader book on the broader theme of belonging. So it is an 8-day retreat. So rather than chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, it's day 1, day 2, and so on to day 8. And it takes you through the spiritual exercises using the wisdom of Pope Francis, both his wisdom as Pope, his teachings as Pope, but also the talks he used to give as a spiritual director, as a Jesuit formator, back in Argentina over a period of 30 years. So I draw also on the book from specifically his retreat talks. So it's on the broad theme of belonging, or rather the crisis of belonging. And that's why the title is First Belong to God. And the rather audacious subtitle is On Retreat with Pope Francis. I did check with him, by the way, in May last year. I said, Father, I hope you don't mind, but I'm writing is subtitled On Retreat with Pope Francis. And he said, oh, that's a great idea. What does the Pope...
I love it. We decided to be audacious as well, and we named the webinar On Retreat with Pope Francis, knowing that people in the first line of the description would know that this is the next best thing to that, as is your book. And you're going to unpack this for us as we go through, and we'll be talking about the 8 days. I did want to mention one more thing I forgot to mention in the intro, folks, that if you have a question for Austin, please put that into the Q&A. I've noticed a few people are raising their hands on the Zoom feature, and we won't be able to respond to those. So if you have a question, put that into the Q&A. The chat is for you to introduce yourselves, but the Q&A is where we will gather questions for the Q&A segment near the end. But let's delve more, Austin, into this notion of a retreat, because reading a book can be an experience of a type of retreat for us, as it was for me. Thank you for this book. I used it during Lent, which we've just emerged out of, and now into the Easter season. And so it was very much like a retreat experience. Pope Francis himself wrote the foreword. He talked a little bit and shared about his thoughts of retreat. Would you share some of that with us, please?
Yeah, so he wrote a foreword to the book, and in which he gives a sort of a general sense of a big theme, which is, and the big theme is, you've got it there on the screen. It's all about the invitation to come out of ourselves, not to get locked in ourselves, but to come out to receive the grace that God is always seeking to offer us. So it offers a little bit of his own discernment about the signs of the times, in a way, for the whole pontificate. And this is going to be a big theme in the retreat, that we live in a time of turbulence and change, in which the temptation is to hunker down, to lock our doors, to go into ourselves. And so his big invitation, it's the whole invitation to the church, really, is to resist that temptation, to trust, if you like, in God's grace, and to open ourselves up to that grace. So that's the kind of the big theme. And he says in the foreword, that he feels very strongly that this is what this moment, this is what God is asking for us at this time, and what we're being asked to do, therefore, also in this retreat. And then he kindly also says in the foreword that really what I'm doing in the book, it's very kind of him to say so, but is to, in a way, to understand the pontificate through the lens of the spiritual exercises, but also to understand the exercises through the lens of the pontificate. So I feel like I'm bringing the two into conversation with each other.
Yeah, it works both ways, and that's a wonderful insight. And the Holy Father gives us a very good understanding of the word retreat, which in some ways perhaps is a misnomer. That it sounds like stepping back, which we do in a sense. We pause, but for the purpose of diving back in. I know there's a parish here in Chicago that has a retreat center, and they named it their Spiritual Advancement Center rather than a retreat center, for that very notion that it's a time to get away for the purpose of jumping back in. And that's what our Holy Father is sharing with us. And you mentioned, you touched on this in your intro, Austin, this notion of the crisis of non-belonging. And this is it had so much to do with the title of your book, First Belong to God. Well, tell us more about what Pope Francis is concerned about and what he means by a crisis of non-belonging.
So, in a way, I've come to understand by studying the pontificate, by writing about it, that in a sense there's a big theme in the pontificate which unites all his principal teachings, which is this theme of belonging, or rather the crisis of non-belonging, which he's seeking to address. So, if you like, the three dimensions of that belonging, and this is a big theme in the book. The most important relationship that we can have is with our Creator, the one who loves us into being and who created us. So our relationship with God, and if you like, the wider community of faith, which was the concern of Evangelii Gaudium, his first programmatic document. Then we have the relationship with the created world in general, which of course is again part of our crisis, right? The ecological crisis, our relationship with creation, that we are partners with creation, that we are fellow creatures, so that we are called to be in that relationship with creation. And then of course the third, and that was the subject of Laudato Si in 2015, and then Fratelli Tutti in 2020 was concerned with our relationship as a human family with our fellow human creatures. So that's, if you like, the triple dimension, which he mentions specifically in Laudato Si, the triple dimension of our belonging, which is in crisis and which we are, if you like, called to repair in our own lives, in our own relationships, but also to help repair those of the wider world.
Those three dimensions really hit home, and I have to admit, I now that you're saying this and I'm reading this again, I had an experience of this yesterday when we were viewing the solar eclipse. We were just talking about this. We had a solar eclipse in Chicago, about 94%, and so for about 10 minutes, people stepped out of their homes, and I was working from home, and I certainly had a sense of the presence of God in this, the majesty of His universe, of creation, and just the stars, the planets, and the birds that started singing when the sun was hiding a little bit, and the fact that neighbors came out of their house and were standing on their front steps, and we all said hi to each other. These all three things are things that are out of the ordinary. But I don't do that every day. I don't step out and just go mingle with neighbors. We don't belong the way we used to. So it's very jarring to have a moment like that yesterday, to realize how often do we stop and realize we belong to God, we belong to creation, and we
And
belong
these
to
and
one
these
another.
and these are graced moments, Joe, aren't they? Because they take us out of the ordinary, and they help us to see at that moment perhaps what's missing, what needs repairing, but also what really matters. And this is
Yeah.
very much a theme of Let Us Dream. It's what happened in the COVID crisis. Is so many of us had this kind of stoppage, and we were able to see again with a
Mhm.
greater clarity. In a way, that's what a retreat is. It's not a wellness holiday. It is a chance really to see reality, the reality of ourselves and our world, with much greater clarity.
Exactly. And you mentioned before that the retreat it's an 8-day retreat, and so you have the book arranged according to 8 days. And perhaps you can expound a little bit more on what you mean by a day, because I don't think you're just like in the creation story. I don't think you're talking about 24-hour periods. But we're going to start in a moment, taking us through day one. So maybe give us a little bit background about the thought of days, and then walk us through the first day one, which is the theme of being wonderfully made.
So I think this will be well known to many of you who are watching, but the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius are classically given over a month. That's in their classical form. So they're divided into four so-called weeks, which are not actually necessarily calendar weeks. You go away for a month, but actually a week is a different part of the retreat. So an 8-day retreat, which is how most people do the spiritual exercises, is the month-long 4-week retreat in summary form.
Okay.
But we still go through those 4 weeks. It's a little bit kind of confusing, but I do mention in the book, we're now in week 1, and then we're going to week 2, week 3.
Okay.
So week one is all about, first of all, knowing who we are in relationship to God, and then the whole question of sin and mercy, and receiving and living from God's grace. So that's the big theme of week one. And so the first 3 days of this 8-day retreat are spent, if you like, in week one.
I
So
see.
day one, which is called Wonderfully Made, introduces us to who we are as creatures of a God who has created the world out of love and, as it were, out of nothing, ex nihilo, meaning we are not created, in order to meet some need of God's, but out of sheer abundant love. And actually, one of the hardest things we can do is actually embrace the implications of that, which is, as a spiritual director said to me many years ago, all is gift, and how hard that is
Mm,
really, really to live out of and to understand. But day one is centered on, and I ought to say, by the way, each day there are 4 reflections, as if they're like 10-15 minute talks, if they were actually talks, but they're reflections. At the end of each reflection, there's a question to ponder. So the first, day one is called Wonderfully Made, which is about understanding ourselves as God-belonging creatures made out of love for love. And in terms of the spiritual exercises, the key exercise here is what's known as the principle and foundation, the very famous way in which Ignatius begins the spiritual exercises. We're not yet quite in week one when he talks about how we are created to love and serve and praise our Lord, our God, and so on. It's a very, very famous summary in a paragraph of why we exist, what we were made for, and what we're called to do. So day one is all about coming to accept that that is who we are and what we're here for. And I particularly invite you to contemplate the Gospel of John right at the beginning,
mm-hmm.
when John turns to the disciples and says, "What do you want? What are you looking for?" And to invite you to think about what you might say there.
Yeah, I'd like to comment a little bit. You mentioned the idea of, the one of the main thrusts of this day one is that life is a gift, and I just had to smile to myself because this is an inside story with me and my best friend Joe. We went to high school together, Jesuit high school, and then went to Jesuit University, Loyola University. We took one course together. He went into dentistry, I went into theology and history. But we took one theology course together, and it was a Jesuit priest. He was from Italy, very heavy Italian accent. And one of his favorite lines was saying, "Life is a gift. Life is a gift." And I'm not making fun of his type. That's how it sounded. Well, me and my friend Joe, being a couple of teenagers, we picked up on that, and we weren't didn't have much depth spiritually at the time or anything. We would joke with each other, "Joe, life is a gift. Life is a gift." Well, now we've been best friends for 50 years, and how often we find ourselves, sitting looking at a sunset together and just turning to each other and say, "You know what? Father Peter was right. Life is a gift." And that's a huge thrust of this day one. Another beautiful thought is what Thomas Merton talks about. Reaching this virginal point where everything seems fresh, everything seems new. And what a beautiful gift that is to realize that every time we pray, we can reach this le point vierge, if I'm
Le
saying it
point vierge,
correctly.
yes. That's right, le point vierge, the virgin point, the point from which everything is created and made. And this idea that of creatio continua, that actually the world is being constantly made. The creation of the world didn't just happen at one point, and that we are part of that creation, that new creation that St. Paul talks about, which is being constantly remade. So that at the beginning of a retreat is really a chance to believe in the possibility of really making a retreat. I actually say in day one, do we think about what we're really saying when we say I'm going to make a retreat? Actually, we are taking part in this act of creation or recreation. So to believe in that fresh possibility, le point vierge is a very important kind of, it's a mindset or a confidence to have at the beginning of this retreat, which I'm inviting you to.
And I found that very inspiring for anyone who's in pastoral ministry. Is that anything that we do in pastoral ministry should invite people to this feeling, that any catechesis that we offer, any liturgy and worship that we invite people to, should give people this sense of newness and possibility and freshness. And so I just found that to be a wonderful gift to offer, and that the day one. So now we move on to day two. And the theme of day two is to come out of ourselves. And there are some nuances here that the Holy Father really helps us to understand. So, Austin, help us to understand this notion of what it means for us to come out of ourselves in day two.
So traditionally, at the beginning of the spiritual exercises, week one of the spiritual exercises, it's often described as the time when we dwell on our sin, which sounds like a rather forbidding way to spend a week or a day. In reality, what we're doing is we're learning or we're contemplating our dependence on God's grace. Because really, sin, failure, weakness, frailty, and limitations, which of course a major part of our human condition, are an invitation to depend on, to open ourselves out to God's grace. And so I actually begin this day with remembering how Jorge Mario Bergoglio, as Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, stood up in front of the cardinals in March 2013. And he gave this very short address, which left many of them convinced that the Holy Spirit had already chosen the next pope. And in that short address, he offered the image of a church that had, as it were, become self-referential, closed in on itself, like the bent-over woman in Luke's gospel who cannot see the horizon, can only kind of look down. This idea of kind of paralysis, very, very similar to what Augustine, or St. Augustine describes sin as, curvatus in se, curved in on ourselves. So the invitation of this day is to come out of ourselves, to understand our radical dependence on God's grace, that actually everything that we have, everything that where we start from, again, it is all gift. So to invite you to understand what are the triggers, what are the bases of my distrustful self-withholding? What is it that leads me to want to depend on my own resources and to resist the reality of who I am? That's really the topic there of the first day.
And this idea
Day
of,
two.
as you mentioned, the idea of focusing on our sin is not a wallowing in our sin. And this concept obviously is coming from our Holy Father, who's Jesuit, and it's a very Jesuit notion. I was at a talk earlier this year about Jesuit priests who talked about how in their formation, there was this focus early on about our sinfulness. And he said, but it's within the context of mercy. And so in other words, it is the admission of sin that is liberating, allows us to come out of ourselves instead of being, tightly wrapped, curved in on ourselves. And this Jesuit priest talked about how when our Holy Father gave his first interview and he was asked, who is Jorge Bergoglio? Can you tell us how that story proceeds, Austin?
Yeah, he said a sinner who has been forgiven, a forgiven sinner, which is a kind of classic, actually very classic Jesuit way of understanding ourselves. So we are sinful beings who have been, as it were, rescued, remade by our Creator, and to understand there's a humility there to understand that actually all that we have and we do, is not contrary to what we are fed so much from our culture. Yeah, we don't earn it. We're convinced, aren't we, that we need to earn everything. So actually the heart of this day of day two is the fall, which is of course an important contemplation in the exercises. And I really make use here of Romano Guardini and his understanding of power. Romano Guardini is one of those authors that has had a big impact on Bergoglio. So I use both Guardini and Bonhoeffer, who kind of go into what actually is the lie at the heart of the Garden of Eden, of the serpent's temptation. That lie that, in a way, that God is a rival, that we need to depend on ourselves. It's to sow that mistrust of our Creator. But to understand that that is the illusion, the myth, as it were, that lies, in a way, at the root of all sin. I must say, when I came to understand this, it was a revelation to me to understand, well, actually, we all do fall into this illusion. And why do we believe this? Why do we come to understand that myth? So it's humbling, isn't it, to accept that that we all have that temptation.
Yes, humbling and liberating. And as I recall, the Jesuit priest who gave that talk and told that story about Pope Francis said that, the media covered it and said, "Wow, the Holy Father said that he's a sinner." And this Jesuit priest said he and his fellow Jesuits were sitting watching it on TV, and they all nudged each other and said, "He's a Jesuit."
Yeah.
To them it was like no big deal. It's like, yeah, that's what a Jesuit would say. And so it's really just, but I love that notion of being liberating and freeing us to come outside of ourselves. So let's move
And
on to day three, Austin, and talk about the theme here, the Lord of the world. So now we're really moving out in our perspective and not just talking about ourselves, our sinfulness, and so on, but being invited to explore the cosmos. It almost seems like. So walk us through day three and the theme
so
here.
day three, Joe, we're still in the first week, and what I've chosen to do with this day is, in a way, probably the most radical decision that I made in terms of how I'm laying out the exercises, because I take something that Ignatius invites us to do as part of his contemplation of sin and mercy, which is to call attention to the ways of the world, or worldliness. And Ignatius, that's part of the contemplation on sin. And I've decided to make it a theme of the whole day because for Pope Francis, this is absolutely key. You may have remember very shortly after his election that he started to use this expression called of spiritual worldliness. And I think most people frankly scratched their head and said, what the
Mm,
heck is that?
mm,
We know kind of what worldliness is, but what is spiritual worldliness? And it turned out it comes from Henri de Lubac's book on the church, which had a huge impact on Bergoglio. But again, part of his discernment of the problem that the church has in the contemporary age, the reason why it has had difficulty in evangelizing in a way is that it has turned in on itself and come to
mm,
depend on its own resources. So what is worldliness? Worldliness is the lure or the myth of self-sufficiency, to believe that we can do, as it were, without God. And spiritual worldliness is the particular temptation of religious people and the church to do the same thing, even though it's dressed up in religious garb.
mm,
So I actually think this is it's a very, very important chapter. Now, the title, The Lord of the World, comes from a book written by a Brit. He was actually a convert Catholic, the son of the then Archbishop of Canterbury, so a rather famous convert in his age, called Robert Hugh Benson. And he wrote this book called The Lord of the World, which is a sort of dystopian fantasy about the future, in which he imagines a future in which worldliness has taken over the world. And Bergoglio used to often mention this book, but as Pope, and I can tell you this as a journalist, having kind of followed him, my journalist colleagues would say the same. It's probably the book that he is most cited as Pope,
mm,
and the book that he has most urged us journalists, but also everybody else, to read. And he often says, look, if you really want to understand this, now he's used it recently, for example, over gender ideology, the attempt to annul differences between male and female. So the idea is that we create, as it were, a world of our own confection,
mm.
rather than trusting in the world that we have been given by God. That's
Okay.
worldliness.
Yeah, and that whole notion of self-sufficiency is that's also very liberating because and that is the original sin. I often tell people it's not that Adam and Eve simply disobeyed, is that they were tempted to grasp for and hold on to self-sufficiency. We don't need God. And a friend of mine once told me it's one of the greatest insights a friend ever shared with me in life. He said, Joel, when receiving the Eucharist is the greatest way that we admit that at our deepest level, we are incapable of sustaining ourselves.
Right.
And I just think that's so powerful. And it's also helped me to recognize how the people who seem to get that the most are people who are in 12-step groups who
Right.
realize the helplessness
That's right.
and that the healing can only come when we're liberated from that notion of self-sufficiency. So some really very powerful things here. Let's move on to the theme of day four, which is the notion of called, chosen, and sent, and the notion of Jesus calling us, sending us on a mission, and the themes of woundedness and failure. So help us walk through the notion of the theme of day four of our retreat.
So in day four, we're now moving into what is known in the spiritual exercises as week two, which is when we hear the call of the good king, and the famous exercise in which we are invited, as it were, to hear the call of Christ to us individually as a person in my life, here and now. And what Ignatius is inviting us to do in this part of the exercises is to, if you like, get to know Jesus, hear his call
Mm,
to us, and learn about the kingdom. What is the kingdom? What is it that we are being called to? So, in a way, it's understanding that the way Christ operates, which reflects, of course, God's ways, are not our ways. And this is where, there's a nice link between the previous day, because in a way, we need to be liberated from the worldly understanding of how to get things done, to a
mhm,
very different way, and actually to contemplatively enter into that space where we're getting to know as disciples how it is that Jesus operates. So one of the things that I'm inviting you to do in this day is not only to sort of let God look at you, let Jesus look at you and enter into relationship with him, but also for you to follow Jesus and to say, why is it that he does what he does, lives where he lives, chooses what he chooses?
mhm.
And it's to follow his way, if you see what I mean. So that's a core part of this day, is to understand, as it were, that the call of the kingdom is a very particular kind of call, which demands that we need to reassess the way we need to do things. So I talk about two temptations. Either one is to follow Jesus without his kingdom, and the other is to seek his kingdom without Jesus. And
Mm.
it seems to me both of those temptations are ones that Francis has often addressed very directly in his teachings.
Yeah, that boy, that just made my head spin a little bit. I remember reading that part there too, and it's how either one of those we can fall into and find ourselves doing. And I love your emphasis on this notion of this part of the retreat being on getting to know Jesus. That, of course, is a huge thrust of the new evangelization. That we're not just talking about knowing about Jesus, but coming to know Him, enter into relationship with Him. And I like to tell people about how important it is that if you love someone, you should be able to talk about them. You should be able to describe their hopes, their dreams, their desires, their fears, their anxieties. If you were to ask me about my wife, Joanne, of almost 42 years, I should be able to talk to you about her because I love her, and we can talk about people we love. And so this part of the retreat seems to be inviting us to get to know Jesus better, to know his mind and his heart. Am I on the right track?
That's it. That's exactly right. But also to understand the nature of the kingdom. So I quote a lot from Francis here. Francis, I think, is really good on understanding that the kingdom is not spectacular. It's not triumphalist. It's not, it doesn't make the headlines. It's
Mm,
below radar. It's in the little, the ordinary, the everyday. So one of the things to understand in this day, which certainly has been, I've drawn great profit from in my own retreats, is to understand, how is it that the world is going to change? How is it that God is going to save the world through this way? So, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves, if all the possible ways in which God might choose to save us, it could be the might of Rome, the wisdom
mm,
of Athens, or indeed the religious purity of Jerusalem. But instead, Jesus chooses, the humble path, the margins of Galilee, among the
mm.
poor. Why is it that he goes there? And to invite you to reflect on that in your own life. How much do we seek? We actually confuse the pursuit of the kingdom and God's way with actually a kind of a worldly way. We need to enter into his, or God's, way of understanding, which is to act in the ordinary and the little in the everyday, but in ways that are open to the action of God. And that's quite a lot to grasp.
And we're halfway through the week. And folks, I wanted to remind you that if you have questions for Austin, please put those into the Q&A feature. In about 15 minutes, my colleague Denise will appear back on screen and offer some of those questions to Austin. So use the Q&A feature. Once in a while, I see the hand raising feature go up, and we cannot respond to that during this webinar. So questions, go into the Q&A. So let's move on to the second half of the retreat, day 5, which really brings us in touch with the physical world and Pope Francis's call for us to recognize our relationship, so not only with God, but with all of creation. So take it away, Austin. Tell us about day
Thanks.
5.
Yeah, so day 5 is called The Ecology of Mercy on Ourselves as Creatures Partnered with Creation. And of course, the theme here is our relationship with the created world. But in terms of the exercises, I have put in this day that what I might call the most famous or iconic of the meditations of the spiritual exercises, and that is the meditation on the two standards. So when Ignatius famously asks us to imagine Satan calling his minions together and sending them out to tempt us, and then conversely go over to Jerusalem and see Jesus talking to his disciples about, again, how do we save the world? So this, the connection that I'm making here, again, quite boldly, but I think it works, is to understand that the challenge of ecological conversion, which really demands a whole transformation in our mindset, in what we value, in how we act, what we do, what we buy, and so on, the way our economy is structured, and so on. The ecological conversion to which Laudato Si is calling us is really a very, very deep conversion of the kind that Ignatius sets before us in the two standards. So that's the theme, or that's how I've used this day, and to ask us particularly to enter into Laudato Si, to understand the, if you like, the temptations and the illusions, the deceits of the rebel chief, in Ignatius's terms, in the way our consumerist society often keeps us trapped in particular ways of thinking and ways of behaving. And that, if you like, Jesus is calling us out of that. So I use some really quite vivid, powerful ecological contemplations to invite you to see that choice in front of you, to see that crossroads in your life, in all of our lives.
And it does work beautifully because, it resonates with us. I think we all know that being in touch with nature somehow brings us in touch with our spirituality. That when we want to get our head straight, we take a walk outside. When we go on a retreat centers are almost always in a pastoral setting, somehow to bring us in touch with nature. It's very rare. In fact, I don't know of any retreat centers that are in the 12th floor of a high rise in an urban jungle. They're always out in where we can be in touch with nature so that we're reminded of this belonging that we have, right?
That might be a very modern way of doing a retreat. I think in Ignatius's time, he would sort of put people in a darkened room for a month and sort of keep them, because outside would be sort of busy and smelly and so on. But yeah, no, we do nowadays, we do get deeply refreshed, don't we, by contact with creation, which in itself is a sign of how much we have lost that relationship with creation.
Yes.
And that sense of that need to reconnect with it. But I think the ecological conversion to which Francis is calling us is to not just perceive what we have lost, but to understand that somehow the way we relate to creation is in itself has become problematic, because we see creation as something to be used, exploited, and commodified, rather than, again, to come to that, back to the topic of gift, rather than be received as a gift and also as a responsibility for which we are in some way called to take part in the care of.
And so we've talked about, the crisis of not belonging, non-belonging, and the three dimensions: God and nature, ecology, and our neighbors. And now on day 6, as we move into, we have the theme of around the common table and the theme of synodality. And this can be a word that a lot of people are like, oh, I'm not sure if I really like that word or understand that word, but it has so much to do with being with this fraternal love that is at the heart of the sense of belonging. So walk us through day 6 and help us to understand this idea of synodality a little bit better.
So the part of the spiritual exercises which I invite you into in day 6 is known as the 3 classes of men. That's to say, 3 people who have a different kind of attachment.
Okay.
And Ignatius invites us to look at our own lives and see what are we attached to that, as it were, keeps us from being free to receive others and indeed the world as a gift. And the theme, as you say, is synodality and fraternity, which for me, I've come to see as more and more linked. So the call to fraternity that Francis makes in Laudato Si, which is a call to the whole of humanity, is one that we in the church serve by becoming synodal. And synodality means to recover the ancient church practice of opening ourselves up to the action of the Spirit through entering into dialogue and deep listening to each other. So we listen to the Spirit by listening deeply to each other. And that, of course, is the journey we've been on through the Synod on Synodality over the last 2 to 3 years. And I've been involved in it at various stages. And I've come to understand by being involved in it just how essential it is. So in this day, I mean, I go into both obviously in detail, but really what I wanted to focus on in this day is to understand what are the virtues and the mindsets that we need to become synodal and indeed to be fraternal. How do we become disciples who reconcile, peacemakers? How do we become, in our fractured, polarized world, agents of unity and reconciliation? And I guess what I'm doing in this day is to the call to holiness, if you like, that's made in this day is a call to a mindset of deep humility, to understand that we don't so much possess the truth as the truth comes to possess us when we enter into these deep relationships of listening and dialogue to each other, and to see that there is a mindset there that's needed that will save us, save our church, but also will save the world.
And this notion of relationality is at the heart of Catholicism. I mean, the very fact that we believe we're made in the image and likeness of God, and that is a God who is relational, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so God's very essence is relationality. And so when we live fraternally, when we follow a synodal path and recognize the common table, we're truly living in the image and likeness of our Creator.
Yeah, and that's what's so beautiful about this synodal journey that Francis has called us on, is that it is a recovery of our own DNA. It's the recovery of of who we are. It's not coming in from, as it were, from the outside.
I like that your way of saying that, the recovering what's in our DNA. That's a great way of helping us to understand that. So we're going to be doing Q&A in just under 10 minutes. And it looks like there's a number of questions lining up in the queue, and Denise is sorting through them. And so we just have 2 more days and then a wrap up for us to go through, for Austin to lead us through. So let's quickly get to day 7. And the title is a little jarring, The Triumph of Failure. Tell us about this now, Austin.
So we've been through week 1, Sin and Mercy, week 2, which is the call of Christ and the call to discipleship. And the final 2 days of the retreat will be week 3 and week 4 of the classic spiritual exercises. So week 3, in this case, day 7, is the contemplation of the Passion. And tomorrow, the final day, day 8, will of course be the resurrection. So in day 7, this rather startling title, The Triumph of Failure, comes from a book by a theologian called John G. Navone, an American Jesuit who lived in Rome, who wrote this very startling book back in the 90s, which had a very big impact on Jorge Mario Bergoglio when he was in his own period of desolation. We, as his biographers, often refer to it as his kind of exile period, when it's a long and complicated story, but he ended up in a state in his 50s, really, in his late 50s, a time of tremendous desolation and depression, and a midlife crisis, I suppose we would call it. And he read this theology of Navone's, and it gave him, I think it had a very, very profound impact on him. And when I read the book, I could see why. It's a really, really stunning book. In a sense, what it's inviting us to is to understand that what Jesus does, again, going back to how God saves the world, how God saves us, how Christ saves us, is through what in worldly terms would be an act of failure. And Navone really invites us to see, look at the end of Jesus's ministry, actually before the end of Jesus's ministry, he had failed. Everybody had turned against him. Were abandoning him. The hostility to him grew, and of course he ends up crucified, living the fate of complete, as it were, failure of a provincial, nobody, a humiliating death on the cross. And again, Navone kind of comes back to the question: well, how is it that this saves us? So this is, I think, quite a rich chapter. And the other, without kind of going too much into that theology, the other source I draw on, which to me has made a big impact, is from a writing of Jorge Mario Bergoglio's from that period in the 90s, in which he uses an early church father's understanding of the cross as a baited hook, which, as it were, God uses to entrap Satan. And I find this kind of fascinating, the way Bergoglio understands this and deals with it. It made a big impact on me when I first read it, and so I'm using it here as part of the contemplation. And I'm also using a third sort of source for the chapter, is a remarkable little book which Pope Francis has given to many people, including many bishops, and he gave me a copy actually last year, which is called Little Brother, and it's the account of an Eritrean migrant who goes all the way across North Africa and then crosses the Mediterranean to Spain. And he just endures literally a via crucis. I mean, everything bad that can possibly happen to a person happens to him. And so what are the eyes with which we can view migration? How do we see a migrant, through the eyes of the cross? That's all about that day, the triumph of failure.
And you indicated when you started talking about day 7 that it seems like there's a rather seamless connection between day 7 and day 8. So I'm going to let you just continue on through and help us to understand how the retreat culminates now on day 8.
So in weeks 3 and 4, Ignatius is inviting us now not just to hear Christ, to follow Christ, to understand the kingdom, but actually to enter into it, to be with Christ in his suffering, and then now on the final day in day 8 or in week 4 in his resurrection. So just as we suffer with Christ in the passion, now we come out and we rejoice with Christ, in his resurrection. The title is A New Imagination of the Possible, which comes from a writing of Francis's during the COVID lockdown, a very profound contemplation which he has of the resurrection. So in this final day, I'm inviting people, of course, to do what Ignatius does, which is to invite people into the resurrection, but also the contemplation to attain divine love, a very famous contemplation in the exercises, and then to understand perhaps what isn't in the exercises, but which is big in France, which is Pentecost, and the way in which the Spirit is calling us out into Galilee. And I use at the final part of the book some very interesting reflections by Thomas Halleck in this new book of his called The Afternoon of Christianity, to understand that we are in the church on the threshold of a change of era, and that in a way we're being called into a deep dialogue with non-believers, with seekers. It's a very different world we're entering into now, and to become part of that, to see ourselves, in other words, as called to evangelize in the way that Francis invites us to. That's how the retreat concludes, is in that call to go out to Galilee and to depend on the spirit of Pentecost to become missionary disciples.
And I love the quote on the screen from your book where you say, we know the place, talking about Galilee. We know the place, but we see it as if for the first time in the company of the risen Christ. And it just occurred to me now that in a sense, you've brought us full circle back to one of the first points you make in the book from Merton about being at that point of newness again. And what a beautiful thing to start the retreat that way and then show how it's because of the resurrection that we are gifted with this opportunity for a way of seeing things in a new way. And certainly that's how you would like a retreat to end, is to have fresh eyesight going forward. Let's talk a little bit in a couple of minutes we have before we'll just take a minute or two on this. Tell us a little bit more how to use the book, Austin. This is a book for serious readers, in my impression. I enjoyed it, loved it very much. It invites us to do some work. Tell us a little bit about how people can use the book.
So I suppose that what I've done here is design an 8-day retreat, which if you were to do everything I'm asking you to do in the book, you would need a lot more than 8 days to do it, because
Sure.
this is what's, I suppose, different from an 8-day retreat you might ordinarily do, is I'm suggesting at the end of each day that, you know, you might read a chapter of Laudato Si here or a section of Fratelli Tutti here and so on. So there's a bit of kind of reading to be done. And because what I wanted to do with this book is also, if you like, introduce people to the pontificate. So it's a way of accessing the pontificate of Francis, or the fruits of the last 10 years of his pontificate, through the spiritual exercises. And that's why I've asked people to read things, Querida Mazzini and so on, because really to enter into the pontificate, that's what we need to do. So that leads me then to at the end, I put a layout for the whole retreat to show how it's constructed. So the theme of each day, the sections, which bit of the spiritual exercises, and then on the right there, you see the text that I refer to, some of which are scriptural, but some of which might be from the pontificate. And I explain at the back how to, look up documents and so on. So this is a retreat that I think can be given in a whole number of different ways. And obviously you can just sit and read it at home and do as you did, Joe, in Lent. And I hope, as an individual, you can get a lot out of it. Obviously, it can be done on an 8-day retreat in a retreat house in a classic spiritual sort of setting. And I'm really hoping that retreat houses will use this material for that purpose. But I also think it could be done, and this gets me quite excited, by any kind of parish or group or organization.
Absolutely.
Who might say, you know what, let's do this together as a group, and let's not do it over 8 days. Let's do it over, 8 weeks, for example. So each day is effectively a week. We read the things on our own, we do the prayer each day, and then at the end of each week, we might want to get together over Zoom or in person to share synodally the fruits of what has come up for us and where we think the Spirit may be calling us to go. Now, this could be done by a group with the guidance, and I say at the end, it's always important when you're making decisions to consult spiritual directors, to consult people who are experienced in the way of the Spirit. But I think this could be done in a way, that's the glory of this, is that we can explore the pontificate through the spiritual exercises and act on the call to conversion that Francis has been making to us this past decade by using it in this way as a group, as a parish, as an organization. I think that could be quite invigorating. I think it could be enriching, but I think it also could help us to become more missionary in the sense that Francis believes that God is calling us to at this time.
I couldn't agree with you more, Austin. That's where my mind was going as you were leading us through this webinar and talking to us about the book and how to use it. I was thinking, this really seems like the kind of book that would work well with a group who are going to journey together, and might even have an open-ended, not, say we're going to take 8 weeks or 12 weeks. Just who wants to be in a group, book discussion group, and we'll just walk with it and see how long this takes us. So thank you for recommending that. As we've been going through this, I've seen the queue of Q&A grow. And so Denise has been working behind the curtain to sort through some of those, and we have a good chunk of time left to throw some of these at Austin. So get ready, Austin. Here they come.
All right, great. Yeah, and I'm glad you were talking about how the book can be used for parishes, because you anticipated some of the questions that were coming up. We did have some people asking that very question. Jackie asks, do you feel or think it would be worthwhile to go on this retreat without having a spiritual director? Can she do the retreat on your own?
Absolutely, you can. And in a way, the book offers you everything you need to go through the spiritual exercises under the guidance of Pope Francis. You have, if you like, everything you need for a retreat. But what I also do say at the back is, and this would be true, I think anybody would say this to you who's experienced in the spiritual life, is that sometimes as a result of the contemplations that we do, we feel the prompt of the Spirit. We feel a call to act in some way. Some of us sometimes might feel to make changes in our life, to act indeed undertake a commitment. In fact, this is the purpose of the spiritual exercise. I mean, it was the Jesuit secret weapon. You know, this is how the Jesuits came into being. And obviously, when you are faced with those decisions and you're faced with acting, if you like, on what you, then it's always good to consult. It's always good to find a spiritual director, and above all, somebody who understands the discernment of spirits, because sometimes we can be full of enthusiasm for a particular path, but actually when we examine it closely, we discover that maybe that wasn't God, maybe that was actually coming from us more than from God. And there are ways of understanding and discerning that, but that's where I think we need experienced spiritual directors.
Absolutely. Next question, Denise.
How important is it to have experience with Ignatian spirituality and the spiritual exercises before using this book?
Well, I think you don't need to have had any experience of the exercises, because I explain in the book, you know, I give a kind of summary of what Ignatius is asking us to do. I think, you know, it's probably a big commitment in many ways if you are coming at this fairly cold. And I say in the book, actually, this is really intended for people who, at some level, are looking for a deeper discipleship. You know, there's a sense in which we are being called to the desert here, and it's an act of generosity to do a retreat like this, at least when we enter into it in this way, and that's why, you know, to go back to that very, you know, a retreat is not a kind of a wellness holiday. You know, it's not just about us. Hopefully, we will come out of it rested and energized. But really, what it's about is opening ourselves to God's grace, to the action of the Spirit in our lives, and that's really what needs to be. I think when we go into a retreat like this, we need that generosity of heart, and so it may help, you know, if you've had some experience of a weekend or a day of Ignatian spirituality. But on the other hand, if you're ready to plunge in, I would say there's everything here you need.
All right, on to the next one.
Wonderful. Cynthia asks, can you say more about the gifts and growth that annual 8-day retreats offer after one has completed the 30-day Ignatian retreat?
Yeah. So classically, the Jesuits do the 30-day retreat during their novitiate. When they first join the Jesuits, they do the 30 days. And they might do it one more time in their lives. But generally, once you've done the 30 days, that's it. But what Jesuits are committed to doing is every year they go on an 8-day retreat where they're revisiting the core meditations and contemplations of the exercises. And of course, it's like a journey, isn't it, that we're on, that we as it were, coming back to renew ourselves from the same source. So I now do the 8 days every year, and I find it enormously enriching just to be able to kind of say, okay, this is where I was last year. This is where God was calling me. You know, now where am I? How well have I heard that call? Where am I? And a chance to kind of review the year. So I would, you know, I would recommend it to anybody in the spiritual life. Now, 8 days is, you know, it's a serious commitment, and if you've got a family, and you know, it's a lot of time to be away, and so, you know, a 3-day retreat, a 4-day retreat is also fantastic. You know, I'm a great believer in, you know, we do what we can in the place that we're called to, but the format of the 8 days I think works really well for this purpose. And the other thing is that particularly in Spanish-speaking countries, the 8-day exercise is actually how most people do the spiritual exercises. Most people would never have a chance in their lives to do the month. But, you know, groups go on these retreats and then they invite somebody to give the points, the reflections, which is in a sense what I'm doing in the book. So that's partly why I wanted to do it this way. I think the format is a time-tested one. It works really well, and it takes you on this kind of journey through the exercises in this abbreviated form. And that's what makes it, I think, particularly suitable. It gives you depth, but it also gives you that kind of flexibility, which is, I think, quite suited to the way we live now.
And that's the beauty of putting this book into people's hands, Austin. That the people who are perhaps too busy to even take, 4, 5, 6, 8 day retreat can sit with your book and perhaps with other people. Let's quickly get one more in there, Denise.
Okay, last one. Are all of the authors you refer to and their work cited in your books? This a couple of people were asking about exploring some of those resources further.
Sure. Well, one thing I've done in the book is there's a fairly comprehensive sources section at the back. I haven't wanted to overload the text with a whole lot of footnotes, but each day, if you go to the back, you'll see where I've drawn the material from. And whenever I've cited a book or a source, I've given a full reference to that. So there are, because this isn't just the homilies, the reflections of Pope Francis, or indeed his writings as a Jesuit, but also the authors that have shaped him. So there's quite a lot of, if you wanted to sort of enter deeply into the pontificate by reading around it, there's a lot of material there, not necessary for the retreat, but if you feel inspired or drawn to it, then you'll find all the information there.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Denise. Great job as always. Thank you, folks, for your questions, and Austin for taking them spontaneously and giving such wonderful answers. Austin, I can't thank you enough. I could listen to you all day. You have immense wisdom and knowledge, and we are privileged to benefit from that in this webinar. And so I thank you for being with us, and invite you to offer us a last thought.
Well, thanks, Joe. It's been a real privilege and joy to be with you today. I think this is a very special group that you've assembled here. I can tell from the chat that there's a lot of spiritual experience and wisdom in those who have attended this webinar. So I'm humbled by your making the time to listen to me and to consider the book. And again, to end on a kind of note of humility, really, it's been a huge privilege for me to follow this Pope and to be in a position where I can bottle some of the graces and the wisdom of this pontificate and make them available to the wider church. And so what I think I'm doing in this book, in a way, is part of the same mission that led me to write the biographies and the book with him. And as Bergoglio himself once said about the devotion of Our Lady Untier of Knots, which he sort of almost in spite of himself, he became the source of that devotion spreading, that he said he'd never felt more in the hands of God, that this was not of his doing. And I do feel that about this and about so much of what I've been able to do over the last 10 years. It's been a joy to be an instrument to help to share the gift. And I know that you all will be are a gift to others in helping them to open up to the graces that God is always willing to give us. And if I've helped to do that, it's been a joy and a privilege. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Austin. And it has been a joy and a privilege to have you share with us your wisdom and insights today. My friends, the book is First Belong to God on Retreat with Pope Francis. And I think now you know why Austin was audacious enough to have that as the subtitle, because he knows the mind and heart of our Holy Father, as someone that has worked with him and has a special closeness to him and is able to share that. We invite you to purchase the book. There's a number of ways you can do that. There's a QR code on your screen right now that you can scan. You can visit store.loyolapress.com. You can call our 800 number, 621-1008, and during business hours, talk to a live human being. And just a reminder that the recording of this wonderful webinar with Austin Ivory will be available soon, both in an email link sent to all the registrants and at ignatianspirituality.com. So our thanks once again to Dr. Austin Ivory and to all of you for joining us, and may we continue to strive to first and always belong to God. God bless. Until next time, I'm Joe Paprocki. See you next time.